The phone rang twice before the emergency dispatcher answered. 911. What's your emergency? Victoria Chen Sterling's voice shook as she pressed the phone against her ear with her uninjured hand. My husband just stabbed me with a pen. I'm bleeding, and I think the baby. Ma'am, stay calm. Can you tell me your location? Victoria looked around the marble foyer of their Manhattan penthouse, blood dripping from the wound on her left arm onto the imported Italian tiles. 7 months pregnant and sitting on the cold floor, she felt more alone than she ever had in her 35 years. 515 East 72nd Street, Penthouse B, she whispered, watching Richard Sterling pace behind the floor-to-ceiling windows, his polished Oxford shoes clicking rhythmically against the marble. Help is on the way, ma'am. Stay on the line with me. Richard turned toward her, his 52-year-old face showing no remorse, only irritation. You're being dramatic. Victoria, it was an accident. You moved into the pen. Victoria pressed her right hand protectively over her swollen belly, feeling the baby kick restlessly inside her. The movement that once brought her joy now felt like a reminder of how trapped she'd become. Her millionaire ex-husband-to-be stood there adjusting his tie as if he hadn't just assaulted a pregnant woman. The paramedics are 3 minutes away, the dispatcher said. Are you still bleeding? Victoria examined the puncture wound. The Mont Blanc pen had gone deeper than she initially thought. Yes, it's still bleeding, and I'm pregnant. 7 months. We're sending obstetric support as well. Has your husband left the area? Richard heard the question through the phone's speaker and stepped closer. I'm not going anywhere. This is my home. Victoria realized in that moment that this marriage was never what she thought it was. 20 years she had given this man. 20 years of making herself smaller so he could feel bigger. 20 years of believing that his success validated her existence. That being married to a tech millionaire made her someone important. The sirens grew louder outside their 42nd floor windows. Richard's expression shifted from irritation to calculation. She'd seen that look before during his business negotiations, when he was figuring out how to spin a situation to his advantage. Victoria, listen to me carefully, he said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone she'd grown to hate. You fell and accidentally hit the pen on my desk. That's what happened. Do you understand? She stared at him, this man she'd shared a bed with for 2 decades, and saw him clearly for the first time. The way he straightened his shoulders to appear more imposing, the way his jaw tightened when anyone questioned his authority, the way his eyes never showed genuine warmth, only the calculated charm he used to manipulate everyone around him. Ma'am, are you still there? The dispatcher asked. Yes, I'm here. Victoria's voice grew stronger. And no, Richard, I won't be lying for you. Not anymore. The baby kicked again, harder this time, as if responding to her mother's newfound determination. Victoria had spent 20 years protecting Richard's reputation, managing his image, making excuses for his behavior. She'd convinced herself that his success was their success, that his happiness was more important than her own. The elevator dinged in the hallway outside their door. That'll be the paramedics, the dispatcher said. Can you get to the door? Victoria struggled to stand, her pregnant body making the movement awkward. Richard made no move to help her. Instead, he walked to his home bar and poured himself a scotch, as if assault and domestic violence were just minor inconveniences in his day. Richard, she said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. This is over. He paused with the glass halfway to his lips. Don't be ridiculous. Victoria, you're pregnant with my child. You're not going anywhere. The pounding on the door interrupted whatever response she might have given. As Victoria moved toward the entrance, she felt something shift inside her beyond the baby's movements. For the first time in years, she was making a decision that wasn't about protecting Richard's feelings or maintaining his perfect image. She opened the door to find 2 paramedics and a police officer in the hallway. I'm Victoria Sterling, she said. I'm the one who called. The female paramedic, a woman about Victoria's age with kind eyes, immediately focused on the wound. Let's take a look at that arm. Honey, I'm Sarah, and this is my partner Mike. As Sarah examined the puncture wound, the police officer, a tall woman with graying hair, stepped forward. "I'm Officer Martinez. Can you tell me what happened here?" Victoria looked back at Richard, who was now standing near the windows with his scotch, probably calculating his next move. The afternoon sun streaming through the glass made him look smaller somehow, less imposing than the powerful figure she'd built up in her mind. "My husband stabbed me with a pen during an argument," Victoria said clearly. "It wasn't an accident." Officer Martinez nodded and made notes in her pad. "Where is your husband now?" "Right there." Victoria pointed toward the windows. "Richard Sterling." Richard approached them with his practiced smile, the one he used for board meetings and charity galas. "Officer, I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. My wife is pregnant and emotional. She lost her balance during our discussion and fell toward my desk." "That's not what happened," Victoria said firmly. The paramedic was cleaning her wound now, and the sharp sting helped keep her focused. "We were arguing about money he's been hiding from me. He got angry and stabbed me with his pen." Sarah, the paramedic, looked up from Victoria's arm. "This puncture wound is consistent with deliberate force, not an accidental scrape. And given that you're pregnant, we need to get you to the hospital immediately. Any penetrating wound during pregnancy carries infection risks." The baby kicked again, and Victoria winced. The stress of the situation was affecting both of them. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us for proper medical evaluation," Mike, the second paramedic, said. "And given the circumstances, we'd prefer if you didn't return home tonight." Richard's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the anger underneath. "She's my wife. She's carrying my child. She's not going anywhere without my permission." Officer Martinez stepped forward. "Sir, she doesn't need your permission to seek medical care. And given the allegations of domestic violence, I'm going to suggest you contact an attorney." As the paramedics helped Victoria toward the elevator, she felt the weight of 20 years lifting from her shoulders. The woman who had walked into this penthouse that morning, worried about dinner party preparations and Richard's approval, was gone. The woman leaving was someone she was just beginning to meet. In the elevator, Sarah checked Victoria's vital signs while Mike called ahead to the hospital. "How are you feeling emotionally?" Sarah asked quietly. "I know this is overwhelming." Victoria touched her belly and felt the baby respond with a gentle movement. "I'm scared," she admitted, "but I'm also relieved. Does that make sense?" Sarah smiled. "Honey, that makes perfect sense. You just took the hardest step. Everything else gets easier from here." As the elevator descended 42 floors, Victoria realized she was leaving behind more than just a penthouse. She was leaving behind the woman who had spent 2 decades trying to earn love through perfection, trying to matter by association with Richard's success. The woman going to the hospital was someone who mattered all by herself. 6 hours earlier, Victoria had been living in what everyone else saw as a perfect life. The morning had started like countless others in the Sterling penthouse. The Italian espresso machine hummed to life at exactly 6:30, programmed to Richard's precise preferences. Victoria, moving carefully due to her 7-month pregnancy, had prepared his breakfast at the Granite Island while morning financial news played on the kitchen television. "Futures are up this morning," Richard announced, not looking up from his tablet where he reviewed overnight reports from his tech company's international offices. "The Singapore deal should close by Friday." Victoria sliced organic strawberries into perfect fan shapes, the way Richard preferred them. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. Will this affect your travel schedule?" "The Hendersons are coming for dinner tonight," Richard said, ignoring her question. "Make sure everything is perfect. Margaret Henderson has been talking about your hosting skills to her charity board friends." Victoria's hand paused over the strawberries. She'd forgotten about the dinner party, a detail that would have sent the old Victoria into a panic. Lately, her pregnancy brain made it harder to keep track of Richard's social calendar. "Of course," she said smoothly. "Should I call the caterer or handle it myself?" Richard finally looked up, his expression showing the mild irritation that appeared whenever anyone questioned his preferences. Handle it yourself. You know how I prefer things done. The Waterford crystal, the Hermes place settings, and wear the navy dress. The one that doesn't show your pregnancy as much. Victoria nodded and continued preparing his breakfast. 20 years of marriage had taught her that questioning Richard's decisions only led to lectures about his business acumen and her lack of understanding about their social obligations. She placed his plate precisely where he expected it. The strawberries at 2 o'clock, the whole grain toast points at 10 and 6 o'clock, the organic eggs Benedict exactly centered. Richard's approval came in the form of silence, which Victoria had learned to interpret as satisfaction. The morning routine continued predictably. Richard showered in their master bathroom while Victoria planned the evening's menu. He dressed in his custom-tailored suit while she selected the appropriate serving pieces from their collection of fine china and crystal. "I'll be home by 6, Richard said, adjusting his platinum cufflinks. "Make sure you're dressed and ready when the Hendersons arrive at 7. After Richard left for his downtown office, Victoria spent the morning shopping for dinner ingredients at the specialty markets Richard preferred. Even pregnant, she carried heavy bags up from the parking garage rather than ask the doorman for help. Richard believed that asking for assistance showed weakness. The afternoon flew by in a blur of preparation. Victoria arranged white orchids in crystal vases, polished the already spotless silver, and prepared a menu that would showcase her culinary skills without appearing to compete with Margaret Henderson's well-known dinner parties. By 6:15, Victoria had transformed their dining room into something worthy of a magazine spread. The baccarat chandelier cast perfect light over the mahogany table, set with their finest china and sterling silver. The flowers complemented the room's color scheme flawlessly. Victoria changed into the navy dress Richard had specified, though it was becoming snug across her growing belly. She applied makeup carefully, knowing Richard would notice if her appearance wasn't polished. By 7 o'clock, she looked like the perfect wife of a successful millionaire. The Hendersons arrived precisely on time. Margaret Henderson, an elegant woman in her 50s with silver hair and impeccable taste, embraced Victoria warmly. "Sugar, you look absolutely radiant," Margaret said in her distinctive Southern accent. "Pregnancy suits you beautifully." Her husband, James, a distinguished attorney, shook hands with Richard while complimenting the apartment's view of Central Park. Throughout dinner, Victoria played her role perfectly. She guided conversation, ensured glasses remained filled, and served each course with practiced grace. The men discussed business while Margaret shared news from her various charity boards. "Victoria, darling, this salmon is divine," Margaret said. "You simply must share the recipe with my cook." Richard beamed with pride. "My wife is amazing at making everything beautiful. I'm very fortunate." Victoria felt the familiar warmth that came from Richard's public approval. These moments made all the careful preparation worthwhile. When Richard acknowledged her efforts in front of others, she felt valued and appreciated. As the evening progressed, Victoria noticed how James Henderson treated his wife. He asked for her opinions, listened when she spoke, and smiled at her with genuine affection. When Margaret mentioned a charity event she was organizing, James immediately offered his support. "That sounds like important work, sweetheart," James said. "What can I do to help?" Victoria realized she couldn't remember the last time Richard had asked how he could support her interests. Their conversations focused on his business, his social obligations, his preferences. During dessert service, Margaret followed Victoria into the kitchen. "Sugar, you've outdone yourself again," Margaret said. "But tell me, how are you really doing? This pregnancy must be exhausting with all your entertaining responsibilities." Victoria paused while plating the chocolate tart. Something in Margaret's tone suggested genuine concern rather than polite conversation. "I'm fine," Victoria replied automatically. "A little tired, but that's normal." Margaret touched Victoria's arm gently. "Honey, you know you can talk to me. Right? We women need to look out for each other." Before Victoria could respond, Richard appeared in the doorway. "Ladies, we're missing your delightful company." Margaret's expression shifted subtly, but she smiled and returned to the dining room. Victoria followed with the dessert, wondering what Margaret had seen that prompted her comment. The rest of the evening passed smoothly. The Hendersons left at 10:30, full of compliments for the meal and the evening's entertainment. "Excellent work tonight," Richard said as he loosened his tie. The Hendersons were impressed. "James mentioned that Margaret has been talking about inviting you to join her hospital auxiliary board." Victoria felt another surge of pride. Richard's approval meant she had succeeded in her primary role as his wife. But as she cleaned the kitchen and put away the fine china, Victoria found herself thinking about the difference between the Henderson marriage and her own. James had treated Margaret as an equal partner, someone whose thoughts and feelings mattered independently of their social usefulness. Victoria tried to remember the last time Richard had asked about her thoughts or feelings without relating them to his needs or preferences. The exercise left her feeling unsettled in a way she couldn't quite define. She was living what everyone saw as a perfect life: beautiful home, successful husband, financial security, social status. Yet something felt increasingly hollow about the performance she gave every day. Victoria dismissed the feeling as pregnancy hormones and finished cleaning the kitchen. Tomorrow would bring another day of maintaining the perfect facade, and she had become very skilled at that particular performance. She had no idea that in 18 hours, the facade would shatter completely, and she would discover who she really was underneath 20 years of careful construction. Victoria discovered Richard's affair on a Tuesday morning while watering the orchids in his home office. She hadn't intended to eavesdrop, but Richard's voice carried through the heavy oak door as she tended to the plants in the hallway. At first, where she assumed he was speaking with a client or business partner. Then she heard the tone she hadn't heard him use in years. "Sweetheart, she doesn't suspect anything," Richard was saying, his voice warm and intimate. "After the baby comes, we'll figure out our next steps. I promise." Victoria's hand stilled on the watering can. The baby kicked inside her, as if sensing her sudden tension. "I know it's difficult," Richard continued, "but Victoria is 7 months pregnant. I can't just leave her now. It would look terrible publicly, and my investors are conservative about family values." Victoria set down the watering can with trembling hands. 20 years of marriage, and she was learning about her husband's affair by accident while doing household tasks he took for granted. "Of course I love you," Richard said, his voice dropping to the whisper he'd once used with her. "This arrangement with Victoria is just business now. It has been for years." Victoria felt something inside her chest crack apart. Business, their marriage, their home, their unborn child, reduced to a business arrangement. She moved closer to the door, her pregnant body making stealth difficult. "She's useful for entertaining and managing the social aspects of my career," Richard continued. "But you're the one I want to build a real life with. Just give me time to handle this transition properly." Victoria thought about the past 2 years since they'd started trying for a baby. The late meetings that stretched past midnight, the business trips that seemed unnecessary. The way Richard's attention to her had shifted from distracted to completely absent, except when they had social obligations. She'd convinced herself that his distance was work stress, that having a baby would bring them closer together. Now she realized the pregnancy might have been his way of keeping her trapped while he built a new life with someone else. Victoria backed away from the door and walked quietly to the master bedroom. She sat on the edge of their king-size bed, her hands resting on her belly, and tried to process what she'd just learned. Her phone buzzed with a text from her best friend Maria Santos, a divorce attorney who had been Victoria's roommate in college before Victoria married Richard. "Coffee later, I have news about the Johnson case." Victoria looked at the text and realized she had choices to make. She could pretend she hadn't heard Richard's conversation, continue playing the perfect wife while he planned his exit strategy, or she could finally stop protecting Richard's interests at the expense of her own. She texted back, "Can you come here instead? I need legal advice." Maria responded immediately, "On my way, 20 minutes." Victoria spent those 20 minutes thinking about her marriage with new clarity, the way Richard made all financial decisions without consulting her, the way he'd insisted she quit her marketing job after they married, claiming he wanted to take care of her, the way he'd gradually isolated her from friends who questioned his controlling behavior. She'd given up her career, her financial independence, and most of her friendships to become the perfect accessory to Richard's success. and he'd been planning to discard her once she'd served her reproductive purpose. When Maria arrived, Victoria was sitting in the living room with tea prepared and a legal pad covered with notes. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Maria said, settling her compact frame into the white leather chair across from Victoria. At 45, Maria had built a successful divorce practice representing high net worth women. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her expression was professionally alert. "I overheard Richard on a phone call," Victoria said without preamble. "He's having an affair, and he's planning to leave me after the baby is born." Maria's expression didn't change, but she pulled out her phone and opened a recording app. "Tell me everything you heard, as precisely as you can remember." Victoria recounted the conversation while Maria took notes. When Victoria finished, Maria was quiet for a long moment. "Honey, I need you to listen carefully," Maria finally said. "If Richard is planning to leave you, he's probably been hiding assets and preparing financially for months, maybe years. We need to document everything right now, today, before he realizes you know." Victoria felt overwhelmed. "I don't even know where to start." "Start with bank statements, investment accounts, business records, anything financial you can access. And Victoria, I need you to understand something important. In New York, if he's been hiding marital assets, you could be entitled to much more than 50% of everything." Over the next 2 hours, Maria guided Victoria through documenting 20 years of marriage. They photographed financial documents, copied computer files, and created a timeline of Richard's recent behavioral changes. "This offshore account," Maria said, examining bank statements Victoria had found in Richard's desk. $12 million that he's never mentioned to you." Victoria stared at the numbers. "I had no idea. He always said our money was tied up in the business and real estate." "Honey, this is financial abuse," Maria said gently. "He's been controlling you by limiting your access to marital assets while hiding millions." Victoria's pregnancy complications had forced her to prioritize bed rest over investigation. But what they discovered in 2 hours was enough to build a case. Richard had systematically hidden money, lied about their financial situation, and planned to abandon his pregnant wife once she'd fulfilled her reproductive function. "What should I do?" Victoria asked. "Document everything, but don't confront him yet," Maria advised. "Let me do some research on his business dealings and the hidden accounts. And Victoria, if he becomes threatening or violent, you call me immediately." After Maria left, Victoria sat in her perfect living room, surrounded by evidence of her husband's betrayal. The afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the expensive furniture and artwork that Richard had chosen to showcase his success. None of it felt like home anymore. It felt like a museum exhibit, the perfect life of a successful millionaire. And she was just another carefully chosen object in his collection. The baby kicked, reminding Victoria that she wasn't just making decisions for herself anymore. This child deserved better than growing up watching its mother accept mistreatment as normal. Victoria made a decision that would have terrified the woman she'd been that morning. She was going to fight back. She just didn't realize how dangerous Richard could become when his control was threatened. Victoria decided to confront Richard that evening after dinner. When he was relaxed and presumably more reasonable, she had no idea how catastrophically she had misjudged her millionaire ex-husband to be. Richard arrived home at 7:30, later than usual, carrying flowers and wearing the guilty expression Victoria now recognized as manipulation rather than genuine remorse. "Sorry I'm later, darling," he said, handing her a dozen white roses. "Emergency client meeting ran over." Victoria accepted the flowers without her usual enthusiasm. "These are beautiful. Thank you." They ate dinner in their formal dining room, Richard discussing his day while Victoria pushed food around her plate. The baby was active tonight, responding to her stress with constant movement. "You're quiet tonight," Richard observed. "Everything all right?" Victoria waited until after dessert to make her move. She'd planned her approach carefully, hoping to present the evidence calmly and give Richard a chance to explain himself. "Richard, we need to talk about our finances," she began. His fork paused halfway to his mouth. "What about them?" Victoria pulled out the bank statements she'd copied that morning. I found these records of accounts I've never seen before. $12 million. Richard, 12 million you've hidden from me. Richard set down his fork and studied the papers. Victoria watched his expression shift from surprise to calculation to anger. You went through my private office, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. It's our office, in our home, and these are our marital assets, Victoria replied, proud of how steady her voice sounded. Richard stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor. You have no right to go through my private affairs. Those accounts are business investments you wouldn't understand. Then explain them to me, Victoria said, remaining seated. I'm not stupid. Richard, I have a college degree and 20 years of managing our household finances. Managing our household, Richard's voice rose. You spend money I earn while playing house in an apartment I bought? That's not managing finances. Victoria felt her cheeks burn, but she pressed on. Why didn't you tell me about these accounts? Why have you been claiming we couldn't afford things when you have millions hidden away? Richard began pacing behind his chair, his hands gesturing more aggressively than usual. Because you don't need to know every detail of my business operations. Your job is to manage our home and social obligations. My job? Victoria stood slowly, her pregnant body making the movement awkward. Richard, I'm your wife, not your employee. Are you? Richard stopped pacing and stared at her. Because lately you've been questioning every decision I make, interfering with my work, and now violating my privacy. Victoria realized this conversation was spiraling beyond her expectations. Richard's anger was escalating in a way she'd never seen before. I also heard your phone call this morning, she said quietly. I know about the affair. Richard's face went completely still. Victoria had seen this expression during his business negotiations, when someone revealed information he didn't expect them to have. You were eavesdropping on my private conversations. I was watering the plants, Victoria said. I didn't mean to overhear, but I did. You're planning to leave me after the baby is born. Richard picked up his Mont Blanc pen from the table where he'd been reviewing documents earlier. He clicked it repeatedly, a nervous habit Victoria had noticed during stressful business calls. So what if I am, he said, his voice now completely cold. This marriage has been a business arrangement for years. We both know it. Victoria felt something inside her snap. A business arrangement I've given you 20 years of my life. I quit my career, gave up my friends, had your baby. This is how you see our marriage. You've lived a lifestyle 99% of women would kill for, Richard snapped back. Don't pretend you're some victim here. I am a victim, Victoria said, her voice growing stronger. You financially abused me, lied to me, cheated on me, and now you're planning to abandon me and our child. Richard's grip tightened on the pen. Watch your tone. Victoria, you're getting hysterical. I'm not hysterical. I'm angry. There's a difference. Lower your voice, Richard commanded, stepping closer to her. Victoria stood her ground. No, I'm done lowering my voice, making myself smaller, protecting your feelings. You want to leave, fine, but I'm not going to make it easy for you. Richard's face flushed red. You have no idea what you're dealing with. Victoria, I built everything we have. I can destroy you financially. Not with $12 million in hidden assets, you can't, Victoria replied. My attorney says I'm entitled to half of everything, including money you've tried to hide. The word attorney seemed to trigger something in Richard. His whole body tensed, and Victoria suddenly realized she might have pushed too far. Your attorney, Richard's voice was deadly quiet. You hired an attorney without discussing it with me. Victoria's heart began racing. Maria is helping me understand my rights. Maria Santos, Richard said, his lip curling. I should have known. That bitter divorcee has been trying to break up our marriage for years. She's trying to help me, Victoria said, backing toward the dining room entrance. Help you what destroy everything I've worked for. Take money you never earned. Ruin my reputation with false accusations. Richard followed her, still clicking the pen obsessively. Victoria's pregnancy made her movements slow and awkward. She felt trapped between Richard and the dining room table. "They're not false accusations," Victoria said. "You are having an affair. You have been hiding money. And right now, you're trying to intimidate me." "Intimidate you?" Richard laughed harshly. "Victoria, you have no idea what intimidation looks like." The baby kicked hard, as if responding to Victoria's stress. She pressed her hand to her belly protectively. "Richard, please think about the baby. This stress isn't good for either of us." "Don't you dare use that baby to manipulate me," Richard snarled. "Everything I've done has been to provide for this family. Everything you've done has been to control this family," Victoria shot back. Richard's face went completely white with rage. In one swift motion, he lunged forward with the Mont Blanc pen, driving it into Victoria's left arm just above her elbow. Victoria screamed and staggered backward, staring at the blood welling up around the pen wound. The pain was sharp and immediate, but the shock was worse. "Oh my God," she whispered. "You stabbed me!" Richard stepped back, looking stunned by his own actions. For a moment, his mask of control slipped completely. Then, almost immediately, his expression shifted back to calculation. "It was an accident," he said quickly. "You moved into the pen. I was gesturing, and you stepped into it." Victoria stared at him in disbelief. "Richard, you stabbed me with a pen while I'm pregnant." "It was an accident," he repeated more firmly. "You were being hysterical, and you moved toward me while I was holding the pen." Victoria realized she was looking at a man who was completely detached from reality. He had just assaulted his pregnant wife and was already rewriting the narrative to protect himself. "I need to go to the hospital," she said, pressing her right hand over the wound. "It's just a scratch," Richard said dismissively. "Don't be dramatic." But Victoria could see that the wound was deeper than a scratch, and she was pregnant. Any injury during pregnancy carried risks she couldn't ignore. "I'm calling 911, she said, reaching for her phone. "Victoria, think about what you're doing," Richard said, his voice taking on a warning tone. "Think about our reputation, my business, our social standing. Think about what's best for our child." Victoria looked at this man she'd been married to for 20 years and realized she had never really known him at all. The Richard she'd thought she married wouldn't have hidden millions of dollars. He wouldn't have planned to abandon his pregnant wife. And he certainly wouldn't have stabbed her with a pen and then tried to gaslight her about what had happened. "What's best for our child," Victoria said slowly, "is growing up with a mother who doesn't accept violence as normal." She dialed 911 with shaking fingers while Richard stood watching her, probably calculating his next move. Victoria knew in that moment that this man was capable of anything to protect his image and maintain control. And she finally understood that leaving him wasn't just her best option, it was her only option for survival. The emergency room at Mount Sinai was busier than Victoria expected for a Tuesday evening. She sat in triage, holding a compress against her pen wound while a nurse took her vital signs. "Any cramping or unusual pain in your abdomen?" Nurse Patricia asked, wrapping the blood pressure cuff around Victoria's right arm. "The baby's been moving a lot," Victoria admitted. "More than usual." "That's normal with stress, but we'll want to monitor both of you closely," Patricia said kindly. "The doctor will be with you shortly." Victoria's phone buzzed constantly with texts from Richard, alternating between apologies and threats. She'd turned off the sound, but the screen continued lighting up with his messages. "I'm sorry, can I turn this off?" Victoria asked, showing Patricia the phone. "Honey, you don't need to apologize for protecting your peace," Patricia said. "Would you like me to ask security to note that you don't want certain visitors?" Victoria nodded gratefully. The thought of Richard showing up at the hospital filled her with dread. Dr. Sarah Kim arrived within minutes, a woman in her early 40s with gentle hands and a direct manner. "Mrs. Sterling, I'm Dr. Kim. Let's take a look at this wound." She examined Victoria's arm carefully, then ordered x-rays and blood work. "With your pregnancy, Any penetrating wound requires careful monitoring for infection. While waiting for test results, Victoria was moved to a private room in the obstetric wing. The constant beeping of monitors and hushed conversations of medical staff created a strange sense of safety after the chaos at home. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. A woman about Victoria's age peered around the door. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion," the woman said. "I'm Janet Wilson. I'm in the room next door, and I couldn't help but notice you seemed upset." Janet had kind eyes and prematurely gray hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore the same hospital gown as Victoria and moved carefully, suggesting her own medical concerns. "I'm Victoria," she replied. "Are you okay?" Janet settled into the visitor's chair. "Pregnancy complications at 48. Not ideal timing, but life rarely asks our permission." She paused. "I heard you mention domestic violence to the social worker. I hope you don't mind my saying so, but I recognize the look." Victoria studied Janet's face and saw something familiar in her expression. "You've been there." 15 years, Janet said quietly. "I told myself the whole time that he didn't mean it, that it was stress from work, that things would get better if I just tried harder to be the perfect wife." Victoria felt tears welling up. "How did you finally leave?" "When I realized I was modeling for my children that love looks like walking on eggshells," Janet said. "I didn't want my daughter growing up thinking it was normal for a man to control every aspect of her life." They talked for an hour while Victoria waited for her test results. Janet shared her story of leaving her controlling husband, the legal battles, the financial struggles, and ultimately, the peace she'd found in rebuilding her life on her own terms. "The hardest part," Janet said, "was admitting that the life I'd built wasn't really mine. It was just a performance I gave to keep him happy." Victoria thought about her own elaborate performances, the perfect dinner parties, the carefully chosen clothes, the way she'd trained herself to anticipate Richard's needs and preferences. "How did you know you were strong enough to make it alone?" Victoria asked. Janet smiled. "Honey, you're already strong enough. You survived years with a man who tried to convince you that you weren't. That takes tremendous strength." Dr. Kim returned with Victoria's test results and a social worker named Linda Chen, no relation despite the shared surname. "The good news is that the wound is clean and the x-rays show no complications," Dr. Kim reported. "However, I am concerned about infection risk given your pregnancy. I'd like to keep you overnight for observation." Linda, the social worker, pulled her chair closer to Victoria's bed. "I've spoken with hospital security about your husband's presence. We can keep him from visiting if you prefer." Victoria nodded gratefully. "I don't want to see him right now." "That's completely understandable," Linda said. "I also have information about temporary housing options if you don't feel safe returning home." For the first time, Victoria realized she had alternatives. She wasn't trapped in that penthouse, dependent on Richard's approval and financial support. Around midnight, Victoria's mother, Helen Chen, arrived, having driven 3 hours from their family home in Connecticut after Victoria called her. Helen, 65 years old and barely 5 feet tall, burst into the room like a protective hurricane. "Victoria, baby, what did that man do to you?" Helen's slight accent became more pronounced when she was upset, a remnant of her childhood in Taiwan. Victoria told her mother everything: the hidden money, the affair, the assault. Helen listened without interruption, her expression growing more determined with each detail. "You don't have to stay with him," Helen said firmly when Victoria finished. "I should have said something years ago when I saw how he treated you. You saw it too. Baby, everyone who loved you saw it," Helen said sadly. "The way he talked over you, made decisions without consulting you, controlled your friendships. We were all waiting for you to see it yourself." Victoria realized how isolated she'd become, how completely Richard had succeeded in making her doubt her own perceptions. "I'm scared, Mom," Victoria admitted. "I don't know how to be on my own. I haven't worked in 20 years. I don't even have my own credit cards." Helen took her daughter's hand. "You're not alone. And Victoria, you're much stronger than you think. I raised you to be independent before Richard convinced you to make yourself small. Throughout the night, Victoria's support network grew. Maria arrived with legal documents and a plan for protecting Victoria's interests. Janet checked on her regularly, sharing practical advice about leaving an abusive marriage. The nurses treated her with kindness and respect, never questioning her story or suggesting she should return to Richard. By morning, Victoria realized something had fundamentally shifted. For 20 years, her world had revolved around Richard's approval, his needs, his version of reality. But in this hospital room, surrounded by women who believed her story and supported her choices, she remembered who she had been before she became Richard's wife. Doctor Kim discharged her with antibiotics and strict instructions to watch for signs of infection. Any fever, increased pain, or red streaking around the wound, and you come back immediately, Dr. Kim instructed. Pregnancy complications from infections can develop quickly. As Victoria prepared to leave the hospital, she realized she was making the first completely independent decision she'd made in years. She wasn't going home to the penthouse. She was going to start building a life that belonged entirely to her. Victoria spent her first night of freedom in a women's shelter that looked nothing like the luxurious lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to as a millionaire's wife. The room was small, the bed narrow, and the walls thin enough to hear other women's stories through the night. But she slept more peacefully than she had in months. Maria arrived the next morning with coffee, legal documents, and a plan. First priority is securing your access to marital funds, Maria explained, spreading papers across the shelter's small conference table. Richard's already tried to freeze the joint accounts, but I got a court order preventing him from hiding assets. Victoria signed document after document, each signature representing another step toward independence. The woman who had deferred every financial decision to Richard was learning to advocate for herself. The offshore accounts are the key, Maria continued. $12 million that he failed to disclose in our preliminary asset inventory. The judge was not pleased when I presented that evidence. Over the following days, Victoria began building her new life piece by piece. Maria helped her open independent bank accounts and apply for her own credit cards. The shelter's counselor, a woman named Dr. Rachel Martinez, helped Victoria understand the psychological patterns that had kept her trapped. Narcissistic abuse is designed to make you doubt your own reality, Dr. Martinez explained during one of their sessions. Richard spent 20 years training you to prioritize his feelings over your own instincts. Victoria thought about all the times she'd dismissed her own discomfort to keep Richard happy, the friends she'd distanced herself from because Richard found them negative influences. Sure, the career opportunities she'd turned down because Richard needed her available for his social obligations. I gave up everything for him, Victoria said. My job, my friends, my independence. I thought that's what love looked like. That's not love, Dr. Martinez said gently. That's control. Love enhances who you are. It doesn't require you to disappear. Meanwhile, Richard was waging his own campaign. He showed up at the shelter 3 times, each visit becoming more desperate as security turned him away. He sent flowers to Victoria's mother's house, called Maria's office repeatedly, and began what would become a pattern of public manipulation. The crisis came when Richard appeared at a charity luncheon that Victoria was attending with Eleanor Henderson. Victoria had been looking forward to reconnecting with the social circle she'd been part of as Richard's wife, hoping to maintain some of those relationships independently. She was speaking with Margaret Henderson about joining the hospital auxiliary when Richard walked into the country club's dining room. The conversation around them gradually stopped as people noticed the tension. Richard approached their table with his practiced smile, but Victoria could see the desperation underneath. "Victoria, this is ridiculous," Richard said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Stop this nonsense and come home. You're embarrassing both of us." Victoria felt the familiar urge to shrink, to avoid making a scene, to protect Richard's reputation even at her own expense. Then she thought about her unborn daughter and the example she wanted to set. "No, Richard," Victoria said clearly, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet dining room. "I won't be coming home. Richard's mask slipped completely. You can't survive without me. Victoria, you have no money, no job, no skills. You'll come crawling back within a month. Eleanor Henderson stood up, her southern grace transformed into steel. Richard Sterling, you need to leave this establishment immediately. This doesn't concern you. Eleanor, Richard snapped. A man threatening a pregnant woman in my presence absolutely concerns me. Eleanor replied, Security, please escort Mr. Sterling out. As security approached, Richard made one final attempt. Victoria, think about our child. Think about what you're doing to our family. Victoria stood slowly, her 8-month pregnancy making the movement deliberate and dignified. Richard, I am thinking about our child, she said. I'm thinking about raising a daughter who knows that women deserve to be treated with respect. The room was completely silent as security escorted Richard out. Victoria realized that half the women present were watching her with expressions of recognition and support. After Richard left, several women approached Victoria's table. Margaret Henderson hugged her tightly. Sugar, if you need anything at all, you call me, Margaret said. Some of us have been waiting for you to find your strength. Eleanor's friend, Susan Walsh, a woman Victoria had known socially for years, sat down beside her. My first husband was like Richard, Susan said quietly. It took me 8 years to leave. You're braver than I was. Victoria realized she wasn't as alone as Richard had made her believe. There was a whole network of women who understood her situation and were willing to support her recovery. That evening, Victoria called Maria with new determination. I want to fight for everything, Victoria said. Not just half. I want him to face consequences for 20 years of financial abuse. Now you're talking, Maria replied. Let's make this millionaire ex-husband of yours pay for every dollar he tried to hide from you. Victoria spent the next week documenting 2 decades of Richard's controlling behavior, bank records showing how he'd gradually limited her access to money, email evidence of his affair, testimony from friends who had witnessed his manipulative behavior. Dr. Martinez helped Victoria understand that her recovery wasn't just about legal victory. The goal isn't revenge, Dr. Martinez said. The goal is reclaiming your power and building a life based on your own values. Victoria began attending support groups for survivors of domestic violence. She was surprised to meet women from all economic backgrounds, including several who had been married to wealthy, successful men. Financial abuse is about control, not poverty, explained group leader Sandra Kim. Some of the most isolated women I've worked with were married to millionaires. Victoria started volunteering with the shelter's legal aid program, helping other women navigate divorce proceedings. She discovered that her years of managing Richard's social calendar and entertaining obligations had given her organizational skills that translated well to case management. You're a natural advocate, said the program director. Have you ever considered law school? The suggestion planted a seed that would grow into Victoria's new career path. For the first time in 20 years, she began making plans based on her own interests and abilities, rather than someone else's needs. As her due date approached, Victoria felt stronger than she had in years. The woman who had been stabbed with a pen 3 months earlier had transformed into someone who could stand up to her millionaire ex-husband in public and build a support network of women who respected her courage. But Richard wasn't finished fighting, and Victoria was about to learn just how far he would go to maintain control over her life. Maria's investigation into Richard's business dealings uncovered a pattern of deception that went far beyond hidden bank accounts. Victoria sat in Maria's office, 9 months pregnant and uncomfortable, as her attorney outlined the scope of Richard's financial crimes. He's done this before, Victoria, Maria said, spreading files across her desk. 2 previous relationships with similar patterns of financial manipulation and control. Victoria studied the documents with growing amazement. Richard's first wife had signed a prenuptial agreement that left her with almost nothing after 5 years of marriage. His second long-term relationship had ended when the woman discovered offshore accounts containing money that should have been marital property. Sarah Chen, his first wife, settled for $50,000 after he claimed business debts, consumed all their assets. Maria explained. She had no idea he'd hidden $2 million in Cayman Islands accounts. Victoria touched her swollen belly, feeling her daughter kick restlessly. He's been planning this kind of exit strategy for years. It gets worse, Maria continued. Remember that 12 million we found? That's just what he was careless enough to leave accessible. My forensic accountant thinks there's much more. Private investigator Tony Rodriguez arrived with additional evidence that made Victoria's head spin. Tony, a former police detective with a Brooklyn accent and thorough professional manner, had spent 3 weeks digging into Richard's business connections. This guy's got more secrets than a government vault, Tony reported. His affair partner, Jennifer Walsh, she's married too. Her husband's a federal judge who doesn't know about the relationship. Victoria remembered Jennifer from several business social events. An elegant blonde who had always been particularly friendly to Richard. Jennifer's been receiving expensive gifts purchased with money from the hidden accounts, Tony continued. Jewelry, vacations, even a car. Your husband's been essentially laundering marital assets through his girlfriend. Maria leaned forward. Victoria, this constitutes fraud. Not just divorce court fraud, but potentially federal charges. Victoria felt overwhelmed by the scope of Richard's deception. How could I have been so blind? He's very good at manipulation, Tony said. I've seen his type before. They create elaborate facades and train everyone around them to maintain the illusion. The evidence kept mounting. Richard's company had inflated expenses and deflated revenues on documents shown to Victoria while maintaining accurate books for actual business purposes. He'd claimed they couldn't afford household expenses while spending thousands monthly on his affair. The prenuptial agreement you signed, Maria said, it's invalid because he failed to disclose significant assets. We can argue that your signature was obtained through fraud. Victoria remembered signing those papers 20 years ago, trusting Richard's explanation that it was just a formality to protect them both. She'd been so young and so in love that she hadn't insisted on independent legal counsel. What does this mean for the divorce settlement? Victoria asked. Maria smiled grimly. It means instead of fighting for 50% of disclosed assets, we're fighting for 50% of everything, plus punitive damages for fraud, plus potential criminal charges that could send your millionaire ex-husband to federal prison. The next phase of investigation revealed the full extent of Richard's network of deception. He'd been using his tech company to funnel money into personal accounts, claiming business expenses that were actually personal luxuries for himself and Jennifer. Victoria's phone rang constantly as Richard grew more desperate. His messages alternated between threats and promises. I can make this all go away, he said in one voicemail. Just come home and we'll work this out privately. You're destroying everything I've worked for, he said in another. Our child will suffer because of your selfishness. Dr. Martinez helped Victoria understand that Richard's escalating contact was a common pattern in narcissistic abuse cases. He's losing control of the narrative. Dr. Martinez explained, abusers often become more dangerous when their victims start fighting back effectively. Victoria's support network rallied around her as the legal battle intensified. Eleanor Henderson organized a group of women who had witnessed Richard's controlling behavior over the years, all willing to testify about his treatment of Victoria. Sugar, we've all been waiting for someone brave enough to stand up to men like Richard, Eleanor said. Your courage is giving other women permission to examine their own situations. The baby was due any day, and Victoria's obstetrician was concerned about the stress levels. This legal battle isn't good for you or the baby, Dr. Kim warned. Is there any way to resolve things more quickly? Maria was working toward exactly that goal. Richard's attorneys are starting to panic, she reported. They know we have enough evidence to destroy him both personally and professionally. Victoria had moved from the shelter to a small apartment in Brooklyn, far from the Manhattan social circles where Richard held influence. The modest two-bedroom felt like a palace compared to the constraints of her former penthouse prison. Her mother, Helen, had moved in to help with the final weeks of pregnancy and provide support during the legal proceedings. I'm proud of you, Victoria, Helen said one evening as they prepared for another day of depositions. "You've found the strength your father and I always hoped you had." Victoria was documenting financial records when her water broke. The baby had decided to arrive in the middle of the biggest legal battle of Victoria's life. As Maria drove her to the hospital, Victoria realized that her daughter would be born into freedom rather than the golden cage that had trapped Victoria for so long. "This little girl is going to grow up watching her mother fight for justice," Maria said. "That's quite a legacy to start with." Victoria went into labor knowing that win or lose in court, she had already achieved something Richard couldn't take away from her. She had reclaimed her own voice and rebuilt her sense of self-worth. But the biggest confrontation was still ahead, and Richard Sterling was about to learn that the woman he had tried to control for 20 years was much stronger than he had ever imagined. Victoria gave birth to Emma Rose Sterling on a Tuesday morning in March, surrounded by her chosen family rather than her legal husband. Maria held her hand through contractions, while Helen took pictures of her granddaughter's first moments. "She's perfect," Dr. Kim said, placing the 7-pound baby on Victoria's chest. "And she's going to have quite a story to tell about her mother's courage." Richard didn't know about Emma's birth until Victoria's attorney served him with papers at his office the next day. By then, Victoria had already established a routine of feeding, caring for, and bonding with her daughter without any input from the man who had tried to control every aspect of her life. Emma was 3 weeks old when the divorce proceedings began in earnest. Victoria sat in the Manhattan courthouse, her newborn daughter sleeping in Maria's arms, as Judge Patricia Warren called the case of Sterling versus Sterling. "Your Honor," Maria began, "my client is seeking dissolution of marriage, 50% of all marital assets, including those hidden by the respondent, punitive damages for financial fraud, and full custody of the minor child with supervised visitation only." Richard's attorney, James Bradford, a silver-haired man in an expensive suit, stood to respond. "Your Honor, my client maintains that the petitioner's allegations are grossly exaggerated. Mr. Sterling is a respected businessman who has provided his wife with a luxurious lifestyle for 20 years. Judge Warren, a woman in her 50s with a reputation for fairness and directness, reviewed the initial filings with obvious interest. "Counselor Santos, I see allegations of domestic violence, financial abuse, and fraud. These are serious charges. What evidence supports these claims?" Maria stood and approached the bench with a thick folder. "Your Honor, we have medical records documenting the assault, financial records showing $12 million in hidden assets, and testimony from witnesses who observed the defendant's pattern of controlling behavior." Victoria watched Richard's face as Maria presented the evidence. His usual composed expression was cracking under the weight of documented proof. "We also have evidence that Mr. Sterling has engaged in this pattern of financial manipulation in previous relationships," Maria continued. "This is not isolated behavior, but a deliberate strategy for controlling and ultimately discarding romantic partners." Bradford objected, but Judge Warren allowed the evidence of Richard's pattern of behavior with previous partners. When Victoria was called to testify, she walked to the witness stand with Emma in her arms. The baby had been fussy that morning, and Victoria didn't want to leave her with anyone during this crucial moment. "Mrs. Sterling," Maria began, "please tell the court about your marriage to the respondent." Victoria looked directly at Richard as she answered. He was leaning back in his chair, projecting the casual confidence he used in business meetings. But Victoria could see the tension in his shoulders and the way his jaw tightened when she spoke. "I met Richard when I was 25, Victoria said clearly. "I was working in marketing and living independently. After we married, he convinced me to quit my job so I could focus on supporting his career." "How did that support manifest?" Maria asked. "I managed all social obligations, entertained his business associates, maintained our home, and essentially became his personal assistant and public relations manager," Victoria replied. "I believe this was what marriage looked like." "Did you have access to marital finances?" "I had access to household accounts that Richard controlled," Victoria said. "I never knew the full extent of our assets, and Richard made all major financial decisions without consulting me." Bradford cross-examined Victoria aggressively, trying to paint her as a gold digger who had enjoyed the benefits of Richard's success. "Isn't it true, Mrs. Sterling, that you lived in a luxury penthouse, wore expensive clothes, and enjoyed a lifestyle most women would envy?" Victoria looked at Emma, sleeping peacefully despite the courtroom's tension. "Mr. Bradford, I lived in a beautiful prison," Victoria replied. "The luxury came with the price of giving up my independence, my career, my friendships, and my sense of self-worth. That's not a lifestyle to envy." When Richard took the stand, Victoria saw him attempt to deploy the charm that had worked on her for 20 years. "Your Honor," Richard said, "I loved my wife and provided her with everything she needed. This divorce proceeding is the result of manipulation by her attorney, who has a history of hostility toward successful men." Bradford led Richard through testimony designed to portray him as a generous husband whose wife had become ungrateful and influenced by feminist ideology. The offshore accounts were legitimate business investments, Richard claimed. "Victoria wouldn't have understood the complexities involved, so I didn't burden her with those details." But Maria's cross-examination revealed the holes in Richard's carefully constructed narrative. "Mr. Sterling, you testified that you loved your wife? Is that why you were planning to leave her after your child was born?" Richard's composure slipped. "I never said that." Maria played the recording Victoria had made of Richard's phone conversation with Jennifer. Richard's voice filled the courtroom. "After the baby comes, we'll figure out our next steps. This arrangement with Victoria is just business now." Judge Warren's expression grew stern as she heard Richard describe his marriage as a business arrangement and his pregnant wife as merely useful for social functions. "Mr. Sterling," Maria continued, "you claim you were protecting your wife from complex financial matters. Were you also protecting her when you spent marital assets on expensive gifts for your girlfriend?" Bradford objected, but the financial records were already in evidence. Richard had spent more than $100,000 on Jennifer Walsh, while claiming to Victoria that they couldn't afford household improvements. The testimony continued for 2 days. Victoria watched Richard's public image crumble as witness after witness described his controlling behavior, his financial deception, and his complete lack of respect for his wife's autonomy. Eleanor Henderson testified about the dinner party where Richard had publicly humiliated Victoria for expressing an opinion he disagreed with. Tony Rodriguez presented evidence of the hidden accounts, the inflated business expenses, and the pattern of financial fraud that went back years. Dr. Martinez testified about the psychological impact of long-term narcissistic abuse and Victoria's remarkable recovery once she was removed from the toxic environment. On the final day of testimony, Richard lost his composure completely. "She's trying to destroy me," he shouted when Maria questioned him about the assault. "I built everything we have. She contributed nothing but decoration and social connections." "Mr. Sterling, control yourself or be held in contempt," Judge Warren warned. But Richard was beyond control. 20 years of manipulating Victoria had convinced him that he was entitled to complete dominance over her life. "This court has no right to give her half of what I earned," Richard continued. "She's a parasite who lived off my success and now wants to profit from destroying my reputation." Judge Warren gavelled for order, but Richard kept talking. "That baby isn't even planned. I only got her pregnant to keep her from leaving me for another few years." The courtroom fell completely silent. Richard had just admitted to reproductive coercion in front of a judge, court reporters, and dozens of witnesses. Bradford looked like he wanted to disappear. Maria was taking notes furiously. Victoria held Emma closer and felt a surge of protective anger that gave her strength. Judge Warren recessed for deliberation, and Victoria spent the break in the courthouse cafeteria with her support team. "He just destroyed his own case," Maria said with satisfaction. "Reproductive coercion, admission of financial fraud, public demonstration of his inability to control his temper." The judge saw exactly who Richard Sterling really is. When court reconvened, Judge Warren's decision was swift and decisive. In the matter of Sterling versus Sterling, this court finds clear and convincing evidence of domestic assault, financial abuse, reproductive coercion, and deliberate fraud, Judge Warren announced. Victoria felt her heart racing as the judge continued. The respondent's behavior demonstrates a pattern of control and manipulation that endangered both the petitioner and their child. Therefore, this court awards the petitioner 60% of all marital assets, including those hidden in offshore accounts, plus punitive damages in the amount of $2 million. Victoria couldn't believe what she was hearing. Not only was she getting more than half of everything, but Richard was being financially punished for his abuse. Furthermore, Judge Warren continued, the respondent is granted supervised visitation with a minor child only, pending completion of anger management and parenting classes. Emma woke up and began fussing, as if she sensed the significance of the moment. Victoria stood to comfort her daughter while Judge Warren finished. This court also recommends that the district attorney review this case for potential criminal charges related to the financial fraud and domestic violence. Richard sat stunned as the gavel fell. His reputation, his control, and his financial dominance were gone. The woman he had tried to keep small and dependent had just taken away everything he thought made him powerful. Victoria walked out of the courthouse carrying Emma and feeling lighter than she had in 20 years. The millionaire ex-husband who had controlled her life was now facing the consequences of 2 decades of abuse. But more importantly, Victoria had discovered that she was strong enough to fight for herself and win. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Victoria sat in her new apartment in Brooklyn, feeding Emma her morning bottle while sunlight streamed through windows that she had chosen herself. The modest 2-bedroom felt like a palace compared to the emotional constraints of the Manhattan penthouse. "Look at this view, sweet girl," Victoria said to Emma, who was now an alert 6-month-old with dark hair and curious eyes. "It's not a penthouse, but it's ours." The apartment overlooked Prospect Park, where Victoria had been taking daily walks as part of her recovery routine. Dr. Martinez had recommended regular exercise and time in nature to help process the trauma of leaving her millionaire ex-husband. Victoria's mornings had developed a peaceful rhythm that would have been impossible during her marriage to Richard. She woke when Emma woke, without worrying about preparing someone else's breakfast or managing anyone else's schedule. The freedom to make decisions based on her own needs and her daughter's needs felt revolutionary after 20 years of deferring to Richard's preferences. Maria called while Victoria was preparing Emma's lunch. "The final asset transfer went through this morning," Maria reported. "The house in the Hamptons, the art collection, and the last of the hidden accounts. You're officially a very wealthy woman." Victoria looked around her modest apartment with satisfaction. "I have everything I need right here." "You could afford to move back to Manhattan," Maria pointed out. "Buy your own penthouse, hire help, live the lifestyle you're accustomed to." "I don't want that lifestyle anymore," Victoria said, bouncing Emma on her hip. "It was never really mine anyway. It was just a performance I gave to keep Richard happy." The divorce settlement had left Victoria with assets worth over $8 million, plus the punitive damages that Richard was paying in monthly installments. But more valuable than the money was the independence she had fought to reclaim. Victoria's support network had grown stronger during the months since the trial. Eleanor Henderson called regularly to check on both Victoria and Emma. "Sugar, how are you and that precious baby doing?" Eleanor asked during her weekly call. "We're thriving," Victoria replied honestly. "Emma's sleeping through the night, and I just got accepted to Brooklyn Law School's part-time program." Victoria had decided to pursue a law degree with the goal of helping other women navigate divorce from controlling partners. Her experience with financial abuse and her successful legal battle had given her insights that could benefit other survivors. "That's wonderful news," Eleanor said. "You're going to help so many women find their strength." Victoria's mother, Helen, had moved back to Connecticut, but visited every weekend to help with Emma and provide emotional support during Victoria's transition. "Your father would be so proud," Helen said during one visit, watching Victoria efficiently manage law school applications while caring for Emma. "You've found the strength we always hoped you had." Victoria thought about her father often. He had died 5 years earlier, never knowing how unhappy she was in her marriage. She liked to think he would approve of the woman she was becoming. The legal victory over Richard had consequences beyond the financial settlement. The judge's recommendation for criminal charges had resulted in a federal investigation into Richard's business practices. His tech company was under scrutiny for tax fraud, and several former business partners were coming forward with allegations of financial manipulation. Richard's reputation in Manhattan social circles was completely destroyed. Victoria heard through mutual acquaintances that he had moved to California, where Jennifer Walsh had left her own husband to join him. Their relationship, built on deception and secrecy, was reportedly struggling under the pressure of public scrutiny. Victoria felt no satisfaction in Richard's downfall, only relief that he was no longer her problem to manage or protect. Emma was growing into a happy, healthy baby who seemed to thrive in their peaceful environment. Without the tension and controlled atmosphere of the Sterling penthouse, Emma was more relaxed and social. "She smiles at everyone," noted Dr. Un Kim during Emma's 6-month checkup. "Babies are very sensitive to household stress levels. Emma's development suggests she's in a much healthier environment." Victoria had started attending a support group for single mothers, where she met women from various backgrounds who were all rebuilding their lives after difficult relationships. The group met twice a week in a community center near Victoria's apartment. "I can't believe how much your life has changed," said Sarah, a woman who had left her abusive husband around the same time Victoria left Richard. "You seem like a completely different person." Victoria realized that Sarah was right. The woman who had been married to Richard Sterling for 20 years had been focused entirely on meeting someone else's expectations. The woman she was becoming was discovering her own interests, values, and goals. "I feel like I'm meeting myself for the first time," Victoria admitted. "I spent so many years trying to be the perfect wife that I forgot who I was underneath that performance." Victoria's volunteer work with the legal aid clinic had expanded into consulting for the domestic violence shelter, where she had first stayed after leaving Richard. Her experience navigating divorce from a wealthy, manipulative partner was valuable to other women facing similar challenges. "You understand what it feels like to have your reality questioned every day," said Linda, the shelter director. "That credibility helps other residents trust the recovery process." Victoria found deep satisfaction in using her painful experience to help other women recognize their own strength. She had learned that sometimes losing everything you thought you wanted was the only way to find everything you actually needed. On Emma's first birthday, Victoria threw a small party in their apartment. The guest list included Maria, Helen, Eleanor, several women from the support groups, and neighbors who had become friends. No one from Victoria's former Manhattan social circle attended, and Victoria realized she didn't miss that world at all. "This time last year, I was married to a millionaire and living in a penthouse," Victoria said to Maria as they watched Emma play with her birthday presents. "I thought I had everything." "And now?" Maria asked. Victoria looked around the room filled with people who genuinely cared about her and Emma, not because of her husband's wealth or social status, but because of who she was as a person. "Now I actually do have everything," Victoria said. "Everything that matters." Emma took her first steps that day, walking from Helen's arms to Victoria's with determination and joy. Victoria caught her daughter and realized that Emma would grow up watching her mother make independent decisions, set boundaries, and pursue her own goals. "Emma, baby, Mama's going to teach you to never make yourself smaller for anyone," Victoria whispered to her daughter. As the party wound down and guests began leaving, Victoria sat in her living room holding Emma and feeling more content than she had ever felt in the Manhattan penthouse. The wound from Richard's pen had healed completely, leaving only a small scar on her arm, but the strength that the assault had forced her to find would last forever. 2 years after her divorce was finalized, Victoria walked across the stage at Brooklyn Law School to receive her law degree. Emma, now a walking, talking toddler, sat in the audience between Helen and Maria, clapping enthusiastically for her mother. "Mama!" Emma called out, her clear voice carrying across the graduation ceremony. Victoria waved back, her heart full of pride and possibility. The woman accepting that diploma bore little resemblance to the frightened, pregnant woman who had fled her millionaire ex-husband's penthouse 3 years earlier. Victoria had rebuilt her life from the ground up, discovering strengths she never knew she possessed. After graduation, Victoria's support network gathered at a Brooklyn restaurant to celebrate. Eleanor Henderson had driven up from Manhattan with several other women who had followed Victoria's journey from victim to advocate. "Sugar, I am so proud of you," Eleanor said, hugging Victoria tightly. "You've become exactly who you were meant to be." Victoria looked around the table at the women who had supported her transformation. Maria, who had fought tirelessly for Victoria's legal rights. Helen, who had provided unconditional love and practical support. Dr. Martinez, who had helped Victoria understand the psychology of abuse and recovery. Eleanor, who had shown Victoria what healthy relationships look like. "I couldn't have done any of this without all of you," Victoria said. "You taught me what women supporting women really means." Emma, now 2 years old, was confidently walking between the adults, charming everyone with her bright smile and fearless personality. She had no memory of the tense environment of the Sterling penthouse and was growing up seeing her mother as an independent, capable woman. Victoria had passed the New York bar exam and accepted a position with a nonprofit legal organization specializing in domestic violence cases. Her first assignment was representing women in divorce proceedings involving financial abuse, using her hard-earned expertise to help others navigate similar battles. "You understand the tactics these controlling men use," said Victoria's new supervisor, Attorney General Patricia Walsh. "That insight is invaluable for our clients." Victoria's first client was a woman named Jennifer, coincidentally sharing a name with Richard's former mistress. This Jennifer was married to a successful doctor who had hidden assets and controlled every aspect of her financial life for 15 years. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to leave him," Jennifer confided during their first meeting. "I haven't worked in so long. I don't even know how to open my own bank account." Victoria looked at this frightened woman and saw herself 3 years earlier. "You are stronger than you know," Victoria said gently. "I understand exactly what you're going through, and I'm going to help you find your way out." Victoria's reputation as an advocate for financial abuse survivors grew rapidly. She spoke at legal conferences, trained law enforcement officers, and consulted with legislators on improving domestic violence laws. 6 months after graduation, Victoria received an unexpected letter. Richard was writing from California, where his life had continued to deteriorate. Jennifer Walsh had left him when the federal investigation resulted in criminal charges for tax fraud. His tech company had collapsed, and he was facing potential prison time. The letter was a masterpiece of narcissistic manipulation, attempting to blame Victoria for his problems while also asking for her forgiveness and financial help. Victoria read the letter once, then handed it to Maria. "What do you want to do with this?" Maria asked. "Nothing," Victoria said without hesitation. "Richard Sterling is no longer my problem to solve." Victoria threw the letter away without responding. The woman who had spent 20 years managing Richard's emotions and protecting his reputation no longer felt any obligation to maintain contact with her abuser. That evening, Victoria sat in her apartment, working on a legal brief, while Emma played with blocks on the living room floor. The quiet domesticity of their life together felt like a miracle after the chaos and tension of her marriage to Richard. Emma was building an elaborate tower when she looked up at her mother. "Mama work?" Emma asked, pointing at Victoria's laptop. "Yes, sweetheart. Mama's working to help other women find their strength," Victoria explained. Emma nodded seriously, as if she understood the importance of her mother's mission. Victoria's financial independence had stabilized at a comfortable level that allowed her to pursue meaningful work rather than focusing solely on income. The settlement from her divorce provided security, but Victoria was most proud of the career she was building through her own efforts and talents. On a beautiful Saturday morning in spring, Victoria and Emma walked through Prospect Park, stopping to feed ducks and enjoy the sunshine. Emma ran ahead on the path, confident and fearless, while Victoria followed at a leisurely pace. Victoria thought about the conversation she'd had with Dr. Martinez during their final therapy session. "You've completed a remarkable transformation," Dr. Martinez had said. "From victim to survivor to advocate, that's a journey many people never make. Sometimes I feel like the woman who was married to Richard was a completely different person," Victoria had replied. "She was," Dr. Martinez said. "That woman was performing a role that never fit who you really are. The woman you've become is who you were always meant to be." As Victoria watched Emma chase butterflies in the park, she realized that her daughter would grow up with advantages Victoria had never imagined possible. Emma would see her mother making independent decisions, setting boundaries, pursuing her own goals, and refusing to accept mistreatment from anyone. Emma would learn that women deserve respect, that healthy relationships enhance rather than diminish your identity, and that financial independence is not a luxury, but a necessity. Most importantly, Emma would learn that she never had to make herself smaller to make someone else feel bigger. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text from a new client, a woman who had found Victoria's contact information through the domestic violence shelter's website. "I heard you help women leave controlling husbands. I think I need help." Victoria smiled and texted back immediately. "I understand exactly what you're going through. Let's schedule a time to talk. You're stronger than you know." 3 years after a Mont Blanc pen had punctured her arm and shattered her illusions about her marriage, Victoria had transformed her traumatic experience into a mission that gave meaning to every painful moment she had endured. The woman who had once defined herself entirely through her relationship with a millionaire ex-husband had discovered that her true worth had nothing to do with someone else's success or approval. She had learned that love doesn't require you to disappear, that healthy relationships make you more yourself rather than less, and that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is refuse to accept unacceptable treatment. Emma toddled back to Victoria with a dandelion clutched in her tiny fist. "Flower, Mama," Emma announced proudly. Victoria accepted the dandelion with the same reverence she would have shown for the most expensive orchid from Richard's carefully curated collection. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Victoria said, tucking the flower behind Emma's ear. "Just like you." As they walked home through the Brooklyn neighborhood Victoria had chosen for its diversity, safety, and sense of community, Victoria reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment of simple happiness. She had lost a penthouse and gained a home. She had lost a marriage and gained her independence. She had lost the illusion of security and gained actual strength. Most importantly, she had gained something Richard Sterling had spent 20 years trying to take away from her, the unshakable knowledge that Victoria Chen Sterling was valuable, capable, and worthy of respect exactly as she was. The pen wound had healed without leaving any lasting damage, but the courage it had forced her to find would last forever. And as Emma grew into the strong, independent woman Victoria was raising her to become, that courage would be passed down to the next generation of women who refused to make themselves smaller for anyone. Victoria's transformation was complete, but her mission was just beginning. Every woman she helped find her own strength, every case she won against a controlling spouse, every speech she gave about financial independence after abuse, was another victory over the mindset that had once trapped her. The woman who had once measured her worth by her ability to anticipate and meet a millionaire's needs now measured her success by her ability to help other women discover their own power. And by that measure, Victoria Chen Sterling was extraordinarily successful indeed.